Hello friends. So we are covering the third chapter, understanding experience. It is part 3, I and mine. There is fundamental relation between self and experience. Through this category of the self, ideas such as identity are conceptualized. Important notions of identity, belongingness, emotion, both personal and cultural, self-knowledge, recognition of the other, and the like are all intimately related to the idea of experience. So our understanding of experience and thus the self will influence the way we conceptualize these terms. It should not be surprised to discover that the nature of the self like experience has been conceptualized in different way in a different philosophical tradition. Although the concept of the self is different from that of experience, there is an intrinsic relationship between the two. One way to understand this would be to consider whether one can have experience without a self and whether one can have a self without any notion of experience. The most common way of talking about these concepts tend to regard experience as a needing a self and self that has the experience, and that selves cannot be known except through their experiences. However, common the belief in self, there are many philosophical problems in the idea of self. Let us consider a view in which the self is equated with I. We can begin with simple question as to whether we have an experience of I. When I say myself, I am referring to the I that characterize me. Now, do we have an experience of I, or if I-ness, or indeed of myself, or is the self granted to us only through thought and conceptualization that, for example, could not occur after the experience? If so, then not only is the self independent of experience, but it is incapable of being experienced. Even if the self cannot be directly experienced as a self, but the self is present in every experience. Every experience I have in is my experience. The pain I feel is my pain, not yours, not somebody else. Everything, every experience is qualified by the prefix my, and since it is universally qualified as such, we do not need to invoke it in describing every experience. Instead, that we often do is to displace this adjective my to the position of a subject I. Thus, from saying that I feel my pain in stomach, we convert it into I feel pain in the stomach. But there is something lost when we, by a sleight of hand, replace the my with I. We lose myself and discover a self. This shift from my to I extremely significant. What it does is to make the I universal. Every I is universal self. The idea of universal subject is thus born. The universal subject is related to the universal I and not to a particular my. Linguistically, the shift from my to I remove the idea of ownership present in phrase my pain. This pain is mine, and replaces it with pain as a property or characteristic of a self. This is a wonderful and subtle example of nominalization, where an adjective, my mind, is substituted with a noun. In so doing, it creates an object called the self, which has property like pain, pleasure, and so on. The I now has feeling, but we do not say I have the this mind pain. Instead, we are only left with I have this pain, which is just like saying uh, A has this pain. The substitutability of I means that we could as well say all have this pain. The pain, the feeling is no longer localized to the person who has that pain. Another interesting illustration of this is in the difficulty of using I and my in a simple enough sentence. Although we can have a sentence such as I am carrying my purse, it seems impossible to say something similar about my feeling. For example, I am having a pain seems more correct than I am having my pain. This illustrates how the I is invoked in order to absorb the first person experience. I is ontological and mind is epistemological. Thus, I becomes associated with ontology of the self. Mind is related to the epistemology of the subject. We do not say this is I, whereas we do say this is mine. Any invocation of mind needs a guarantee and a proof, whereas the existence of I makes the self an object that is present, self present. The nominalization that replaces the my with I convert feeling into properties of the self. The feeling of operation is replaced with the property of being oppressed. That is, one's feeling of oppression get replaced by a notion that self is oppressed. Such processes related to nominalization have important consequences in the way we understand the relationship between experience and theory. An intriguing analogy of this process is with scientific discourse, which is marked by the process of nominalization. Here, verbs are replaced by nouns, and this has profound consequences for understanding the nature of science. Therefore, we should be careful in distinguishing different terms related to the self. One such is the subject, others include person, individual, and so on. In the next section, I will briefly discuss the trajectory of the idea of the self in Western and Indian thought. Self and the subject. When we talk of experience, are we talking of self or of the subject or something else perhaps? Is the notion of experience different from those of self and subject, or is experience that which is only had by the self? The theme of self and the related notion of subject are too vast to be dealt with in a small section. Given the context of this book, I will restrict myself to 2 points. The relation between rationality and the self, which is defining relation for the Western understanding of the self. 2. Some reflection on the nature of self as understood in Indian philosophical tradition. Both these aspects are integral to the creation of social theory in India. As Steenworth point out, the idea of self in Western thought are closely interwoven with rationality. There are two conceptions of the self that are available in Western thought. One is the Lockean conception, which is associated with utilitarian rationality, and the other is the Cartesian one. Until the 17th century, in the West, the idea of the self was dominantly influenced by Aristotle and Stoics. In the 18th century, Locke's conception began to dominate. As Stephen Steenworth note, the self has a central position in Western thought because the way it is conceived commits us to a conception of rationality and action, science and religion, and most momentously to a distinction of rational and individualist society from less rational and more collectivist society. Rationality was used as a marker to distinguish culture, and among other things it serves to validate the subjugation of culture as well as exemplify in later colonial discourses. Plato distinguishes different faculties of mind. The higher faculty makes possible calculation and the lower faculty is associated with the desire. Similarly, Aristotle makes a distinction between active and passive reason. But what complicates the matter is the introduction of the will, which is the power to decide what to do even though reason might dictate only one possible path. That is the capacity both to do and not to do a possible action. This idea of the will that has the freedom to choose even when reason suggests otherwise influences the latter distinction created between self and subject. It is not that there was a homogeneous idea of the self in the history of mainstream Western thought. Although the Cartesian self has a play an influential role, there were other formulations such as the Lockean self, which was identified with consciousness, the human position that deny the existence of self, somewhat like Buddhist, and the Kantian idea of the self as a transcendental idea. Steenworth makes an important point. The attempt to understand pre-modern society in Hegel and Marx and the psychologist attempt to describe the transition from the self of a child to that of an adult have something in common. Both of them were concerned with two kinds of selves, and the shift from the collective and authoritarian self of pre-modern society to the individualist and fallible self of modern society. A child moves toward individual responsibility and fallibility, away from being under the authority of the parents. Weber and Freud are unified in their essential view of a self as a moving from being under an authoritarian form to becoming an individualized one. Steenworth argued that the West has produced a concept of two-faced self, in which a collectivist and authoritarian self proceeds an individualist and fallible one. The latter self is a sign not only of modernity but also of Western self, and such a self is in opposition to pre-modern society or traditional society. A similar dichotomy of two kinds of selves is seen in Heidegger's distinction between authentic self and inauthentic self. The latter guides ordinary action. The perceived superiority of the West is fundamentally related to the way the self is conceptualized in its many intellectual traditions. Such a view of the changing self influences Eurocentric and colonial discourses. It has also influenced modern social theory in India. But in this context, there is an important aporia that need to be addressed. If we understand Weber and Freud's description of the two selves as indicative of hierarchies, pre-modern, modern, and child and adult, then can we use them to describe the nature of selves in the Indian social context? Are the hierarchies of Indian society based on such distinction between a self demonstrating individual responsibility and another self that accepts authority? Is such a formulation relevant to clarifying the selves of a different caste group? While I will not deal with this question directly, perhaps the discussion in this book will help us tangentially answer these questions. The sense of rationality associated with the self is emphasized through the capacity for judgment. This is philosophically a profound shift since judgment become a special capacity of human experience. The Cartesian selves manifest this shift following Descartes' distinction between experiences, which include desire, belief, doubts, and judgments, deciding on the content of this belief and desires. This move splits the self into two, one part experiencing and the other judging the content of that experience. For Descartes, judgment is what finally defines the human. The deliberate judgment is what I cannot distance myself from. Hence, it is myself. Thus, the notion of self is primarily associated with that power to judge and therefore function as an agent of judgment. Moreover, for Descartes, as Steinworth point out, the self is indubitable, as the method of doubt presumed to show, whereas the world is dubitable. I would extrapolate from this to argue that experience get sidelined in this view, since judgment is in the self, but experience is of the world, and if the world is dubitable, then so is experience. For the empiricist, knowledge about the world is founded on sense of experience. But as has long been argued, the sense of impression have to be reconstructed, and it has often been assumed that it is the the self which does this task. But this means that the world that is constructed is also extremely private. Such a view of the self also make it passive, and as against this, as Steinworth point out, the self for Heidegger and Wittgenstein is characterized by its capacity to act on the world and not just the construct of world. In the dominant Western traditions, as briefly alluded to before, there is sense of growth of the self. We acquire a self as we grow from a child to an adult, and presumably as we move from the pre-modern to modern. What does it mean to say that we acquire a self? Primarily, it is the capacity of the self to judge and to act. As much as we judge worldly experiences, we also judge ourselves. Moreover, it would be difficult not to take seriously the possibility that an individual has many selves. It should not be surprised that the idea of shame, one that has interested many important thinkers, indicate the presence of these selves. Since shame starts when I become conscious of myself as something observed by other cells in my body. Shame is fundamentally a consequence of the self's power to judge itself. The growth of self is not limited to judging oneself. However, to grow into a full self, many conditions are required, such as the use of propositional language, awareness of dependence on others, and capacity for initiating actions. We'll continue further.